Bem-vindos ao Ibraccast, o podcast do Ibrac.
Hello, Ibraccast listeners. This is the special international series directly from Florence, Italy. Today, we have the privilege of having two special guests, both from the Hogan Lovells Regulatory Global Practice. May Lyn Yuen, a partner based in Brussels, and Lauren Bataglia, a partner based in Washington, D.C. So can you guys share some of the key developments and trends in merger control that you've been observed in Europe and in the USA?
Great. Thank you, Vivian. And I'm happy to go first. Thank you so much to all our Ibraccast listeners who joined in today to listen to us. So I think from the EU perspective, one of the things that's a very hot topic right now that I want to highlight is on the jurisdictional issues that we're facing. And what I mean by that is that authorities around the world have been very alive recently in the last few years to questions about, whether or not they have the right to review transactions that fall below the transaction thresholds that they might have in their regimes. And so in the last few years, we've seen authorities shift their approach maybe from pure revenue or pure asset-based thresholds to, transaction value thresholds. And we've seen authorities, as far-reaching as perhaps India, who are actually looking at that right now. In the EU, however, a few years ago, that approach was rejected. So the European Commission came out to say that we don't need to take a transaction value approach. And what they have now is something they call a recalibrated jurisdictional approach, meaning that they accept that they have a revenue threshold, but they also say that, if there are transactions that fall below that threshold, member states in the EU, national member states can actually make a referral to the European Commission, regardless of whether jurisdictional thresholds are met. And the requirement is that it's a transaction that would have potentially a significant impact on competition in that EU member state. So where does this take us? And I just want to be very practical about this. Where this takes us is a situation where we're looking at mergers these days. If the threshold is met in the EU, then we proceed as, we would have previously. But if not, we still want to look carefully at whether or not the transaction could have an impact on competition. Because I think that the lesson that needs to be taken away now is that there is perhaps a little bit of jurisdictional uncertainty. So running a substantive analysis to the transaction after doing the jurisdictional analysis might not be the best approach. And you want to already think about whether the transaction has a substantive element which would make an authority want to look at the transaction. And just because, you don't have the revenues or the assets in the EU to meet the jurisdictional threshold doesn't mean that you're safe anymore. And I think the last point just to say on that is initially it was thought that, the Commission's powers to review referred mergers would only apply in, the tech industry or in life sciences. And I think we've seen that the Commission actually now with 3 cases under this Article 22 recalibrated approach, we've not actually seen that this could be in a broad range of industries. So yes, there may be a focus, as always, on tech and life sciences, but the 3rd case that the Commission's actually looking at under this referral process is in the energy sector. So I wouldn't say that any industry is particularly safe, but we'll just have to go back to basics, whether or not there's a substantive issue in the transaction in the first place.
Great, thank you, May Lyn. Now turning back to Lauren.
Hi, Vivian, and hi, Ibraccast listeners. I'll just highlight 2 trends. The first being, in the U.S. right now, we're seeing a big push by the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice to reach mergers that implicate competition issues at earlier stages. So we're seeing them push on the bounds of traditional theories like potential competition into new, more expansive types of theories like perceived potential competition to reach mergers that the agencies believe could affect competition at an earlier stage. So where the parties are not yet direct head-to-head competitors. So we've seen this already take the form of enforcement actions, including, for example, cases like Meta Within, where the FTC pressed the theory of perceived potential competition, so where the buyer was, the FTC argued, perceived as a potential entrant into the virtual reality fitness space, and so not yet an actual competitor where the target was already operating. So we've seen them try to bring these cases. This is also reflected in the draft merger guidelines that the agencies recently issued, where we see guidelines related to challenging mergers that would further a trend towards concentration. There's not a lot of detail from the agencies yet in terms of the scope of that type of guideline. So, what accounts for a trend, and at what stage will they actually challenge a merger that they say furthers a trend towards concentration? But the language is there, and it's clearly something that they're thinking about. And then we also see that the potential competition guidelines have reinforced and expanded in those new draft guidelines. So again, clearly a focus by the agencies to reach kind of further back in time at earlier stages of competition or potential competition to reach mergers. The other trend that I'll highlight is around remedies. So for years now in the U.S., both agencies have basically said behavioral remedies will not get your transaction cleared with us. We very much disfavor them. We don't think that they work. But under the current administration, that's been taken a step further, where we actually see both agencies saying that also we don't generally think that divestitures work. So even where merging parties offer what would traditionally be viewed as robust divestiture remedies, the agencies have said, no, our inclination is going to be to actually take those to court and challenge to block the merger rather than accept those. So it's been big, aggressive talk from both agencies, but what we've recently started seeing in practice is that there might be some grayness in terms of those standards. So the DOJ has tried to litigate 2 divestiture remedy cases, again, where the parties offered divestitures, and the DOJ said, no, that's not enough. We're going to take you to court. And in both instances, this was the United Healthcare Change Healthcare merger, and more recently, the Assa Abloy Spectrum merger, that DOJ lost. Or in the case of Assa Abloy, settled in the middle of trial for a divestiture remedy that the parties had offered. So there is big talk. It's still very difficult to get divestitures approved by the agencies, but there seems to be perhaps a shift towards a more pragmatic approach, given the lack of success in court so far on that side. On the behavioral remedy side of things, we've also seen some movement there. So there have been several mergers over the last few years that have been challenged by the FTC and DOJ, where the parties had offered behavioral remedies. Again, the agency said, no, that's not enough. And in all of those cases, the parties either won in litigation, or the agencies ultimately settled those cases and agreed to the behavioral remedies that had been offered. Most recently, this was the case in Amgen Verizon, where the FTC just accepted a behavioral remedy that the parties committed to not bundle discounts for the parties' pharmaceutical products. But this was also litigated just this year in Microsoft Activision, where Microsoft had offered a behavioral remedy that they would continue to make Call of Duty available on the Sony PlayStation platforms and other platforms. And there the court accepted it. They basically said, FTC, why is this not enough to address your concerns? And ruled against the Federal Trade Commission. So there too, we're starting to potentially see signs of a more pragmatic approach that where the agencies are starting to accept that in some cases courts are going to accept behavioral remedies.
Great. Okay, Lauren, thank you so much. This is very helpful. Thank you, May Lyn, so much for this. Very helpful as well. And stay tuned for the next episode.